In December 1944, deep in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, German commanders believed they had finally found the weapon that would break the Allied armies in the West. It was a machine so massive and so heavily armored that many soldiers who faced it believed it simply could not be destroyed. Its official name was the Tiger II, but both German crews and Allied soldiers knew it by a more intimidating nickname: the King Tiger. Weighing nearly 70 tons, the King Tiger was one of the heaviest tanks ever deployed during the Second World War. Its thick frontal armor was sloped and reinforced to such a degree that many American anti-tank guns simply could not penetrate it from the front. German engineers had designed it to dominate the battlefield through both firepower and psychological impact. When the tank appeared, it was meant to make enemy units hesitate, fall back, or panic before the battle had even truly begun. The main weapon of the King Tiger was the long-barreled 88mm gun. This cannon had already earned a terrifying reputation earlier in the war when mounted on other German tanks and anti-aircraft guns. On the King Tiger, the weapon became even more deadly. At long range, it could destroy most Allied tanks before they could get close enough to respond effectively. German crews were trained to fight from distance, turning the battlefield into a deadly shooting gallery where they could eliminate opponents one by one. By the winter of 1944, American and British tank crews had already encountered German heavy armor many times. They knew how dangerous the Tiger tanks could be. But the King Tiger was something even more intimidating. Its armor could exceed 150 millimeters on the front of the turret. In practical terms, that meant many Allied tank crews understood a brutal reality. Shooting directly at the front of the vehicle was often pointless. Stories began to circulate among American soldiers across the Western Front. Crews of the M4 Sherman, the most common American tank, sometimes reported firing multiple shells at a German heavy tank without seeing any visible damage. In some cases, shells would simply ricochet off the armor, sparking against the steel and disappearing into the snow. For the men inside the Sherman, this was a terrifying moment. Every second they remained exposed meant the German tank could fire back. And when the King Tiger fired back, it was usually devastating. One hit from the massive 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman tank almost instantly. The armor of the American vehicle, designed for mobility and mass production, was never intended to withstand such a powerful weapon in a direct duel. American doctrine had always emphasized speed, coordination, and numbers rather than relying on extremely heavy armor. But in the dense forests and narrow roads of the Ardennes, those advantages became much harder to use. In December 1944, Adolf Hitler launched a surprise offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was bold and desperate. German forces would push through the Allied lines in Belgium and Luxembourg, split the American and British armies apart, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. If successful, the attack could delay the Allied advance and potentially force a negotiated peace. To spearhead this offensive, Germany deployed some of its most powerful armored units, including battalions equipped with the new King Tiger tanks. These massive machines rolled forward through snow-covered forests and narrow mountain roads, supported by infantry and artillery. For German commanders, the King Tiger symbolized a final chance to regain battlefield superiority. For American soldiers stationed in the Ardennes, the attack came as a complete surprise. Many units in the region were inexperienced or exhausted from previous fighting. The Ardennes had been considered a relatively quiet sector of the front. Some divisions were resting there after heavy combat, while others were newly arrived troops still learning the realities of war. When German armor suddenly appeared in force, confusion spread quickly. Roads became clogged with vehicles, retreating units, and refugees fleeing the fighting. In the freezing winter conditions, visibility was poor, communication lines were strained, and rumors spread rapidly.
Among those rumors was one particularly frightening message. German King Tigers were advancing through the forests, and American guns could not stop them. Some artillery crews tried to engage the heavy tanks as they emerged from the trees, but heavy snow and thick woodland made accurate targeting difficult. Anti-tank teams sometimes found themselves facing armor far stronger than they had expected. Even when American shells struck the front of a King Tiger, they often failed to penetrate it. The psychological impact was enormous. Imagine sitting inside a tank, hearing the thunder of an approaching engine that weighed 70 tons. Imagine watching your shells strike the armor and bounce away harmlessly. Now imagine knowing that the enemy gun can destroy your vehicle with a single well-placed shot. That was the reality many Allied soldiers faced in the opening days of the German offensive. Yet the King Tiger had its own weaknesses. Despite its powerful gun and thick armor, the vehicle was extremely heavy and mechanically complex. Its massive weight placed enormous strain on engines, transmissions, and suspension systems. Fuel consumption was also extremely high. In a war where Germany was already suffering severe fuel shortages, this was a serious problem. The terrain of the Ardennes made things even more difficult. Narrow roads, steep slopes, and thick forests limited maneuverability. A 70-ton tank was incredibly powerful on open ground, but in confined terrain, it could become vulnerable to ambush. Still, in the early days of the battle, most American soldiers did not see those weaknesses. What they saw instead was a giant machine advancing through the snow, seemingly unstoppable. German propaganda had long promoted the idea that their heavy tanks represented technological superiority. The King Tiger became the ultimate symbol of that belief. When it appeared on the battlefield, many German crews felt confident that few enemy weapons could truly threaten them. And for a time, that confidence seemed justified. Reports from the front described entire American positions being forced to withdraw after encountering heavy German armor. In several engagements, Allied tanks avoided direct confrontation, choosing instead to reposition and wait for artillery or air support. But there was one problem with the myth of invincibility. War has a way of exposing every weakness. Even the most powerful machine on the battlefield depends on the men who operate it. It depends on supply lines, fuel, maintenance, terrain, and tactics. A tank that appears unstoppable under the right conditions can suddenly become vulnerable when those conditions change. Somewhere in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, American commanders were already searching for a way to confront the King Tiger on equal terms. They understood something important about the battlefield that winter. If the German heavy tanks could not easily be destroyed from the front, then the fight would have to be changed entirely. Instead of meeting the King Tiger head-on, they would have to defeat it through patience, positioning, and a weapon capable of striking from distances the German crews did not expect. And hidden among the American units preparing for the brutal winter fighting was a vehicle that many soldiers initially dismissed as fragile, uncomfortable, and dangerously exposed. It had no protection compared to a real tank. Its turret had no roof. Its crew sat in freezing wind and snow, while enemy artillery fragments could fall directly inside the fighting compartment. Yet this strange machine carried a gun powerful enough to challenge even the most feared German armor. At the time, few soldiers realized that this vehicle would soon shatter the myth of the invincible King Tiger. And in the frozen days of December 1944, a group of American tank destroyer crews was about to prove that even the most terrifying war machine in Europe could still be hunted.
By the middle of the Second World War, American commanders had learned a hard lesson about armored warfare. Tanks were powerful, but no tank could be perfect. The more armor a vehicle carried, the heavier and slower it became. The more powerful its gun, the larger and more complex the entire machine had to be. Every army faced the same problem.
how to defeat enemy tanks without building something so heavy that it became impractical on the battlefield. The United States chose a different solution from Germany. Instead of creating the heaviest possible tanks, American military planners developed a separate concept known as the tank destroyer doctrine. The idea was simple but bold. Instead of expecting regular tanks to fight enemy armor directly, specialized units would be created to hunt and destroy hostile tanks wherever they appeared. These units would move quickly, position themselves carefully, and strike at the right moment. Speed, firepower, and tactical flexibility would matter more than thick armor. In theory, when enemy armored formations broke through a defensive line, tank destroyer battalions would rush to the threatened area. Using mobility and powerful guns, they would ambush the attacking tanks and destroy them before the enemy could exploit the breakthrough. Early in the war, this idea seemed promising, but reality quickly proved more complicated. German tanks and anti-tank guns were often more powerful than American planners had expected. As the war continued, German engineers introduced heavier vehicles with stronger armor and longer-range guns. Tanks like the Panther and the Tiger began to appear on the battlefield, forcing the Allies to rethink their own equipment. American tank destroyers at the time, such as the M10, carried respectable weapons, but they were not always powerful enough to reliably penetrate the newest German armor at long distances. In several battles, crews discovered that their shells struggled to break through the thick frontal protection of German heavy tanks. Reports from the front were clear and increasingly urgent. The United States needed a stronger gun. By 1943, American engineers and military planners began working on a solution. The answer would come in the form of a new vehicle built around a weapon that was far more powerful than anything previously mounted on American tank destroyers. This new vehicle would eventually become known as the M36 Jackson. At its heart was the 90mm gun, a weapon originally developed for anti-aircraft use, but quickly adapted for ground combat. Compared to the older 76mm guns mounted on many American tanks, the 90mm offered dramatically improved armor penetration. At long ranges, it could punch through the armor of German Panthers and Tigers under the right conditions. With the right ammunition and a skilled crew, it could even threaten the heavily protected King Tiger. But mounting such a large weapon created serious engineering challenges. The gun was heavy, and its recoil forces were powerful. The vehicle carrying it needed to remain stable and mobile while firing. American engineers solved this by placing the weapon in a large turret mounted on a modified tank destroyer chassis. The result was a machine that looked unusual compared to traditional tanks. The turret was tall and spacious, designed to allow the crew to handle the large ammunition required for the 90mm. But there was one detail that stood out immediately to anyone who saw the vehicle. The turret had no roof. This open-top design was not an accident. It was part of the tank destroyer philosophy. By leaving the turret open, engineers reduced the overall weight of the vehicle and allowed the crew better visibility. Commanders could observe the battlefield more easily, spot enemy tanks faster, and coordinate with other units. The open turret also made it easier to load the large shells of the 90mm gun quickly during combat. But the design came with obvious dangers. Without a roof, the crew was exposed to the environment and to enemy fire from above. Artillery fragments, mortar rounds, and even small arms fire could enter the turret. In bad weather, rain and snow fell directly into the fighting compartment. In freezing conditions, freezing wind cut through the crew's positions with nothing to block it. Many soldiers who first encountered the vehicle were skeptical. Some tank crews joked that it looked less like a heavily armored war machine and more like a gun mounted on a fragile platform. Compared to the thick armor of German heavy tanks, the protection of the M36 was relatively thin. A direct hit from most enemy anti-tank weapons could easily destroy it. For that reason, the vehicle was never intended to fight like a traditional tank. Instead, it was meant to strike from a distance. Tank destroyer crews were trained to avoid direct frontal engagements whenever possible. Their strength was the power of the gun and the ability to choose when and where to fight. If positioned correctly, an M36 could fire from long range, hit an enemy tank, and reposition before the enemy could respond effectively. In open terrain, this tactic could be extremely effective. The 90mm gun gave the crew a chance to destroy heavily armored targets before those targets could close the distance. At ranges where smaller guns struggled to penetrate, the larger weapons still had a chance to break through. By late 1944, production of the M36 had begun in significant numbers. The vehicle started reaching American units in Europe during one of the most critical phases of the war. German forces were still capable of fierce resistance, and heavy tanks like the Panther and the Tiger remained dangerous opponents. The M36 arrived just in time. Tank destroyer battalions across the European theater began receiving the new vehicles. Crews trained quickly, learning how to handle the powerful gun and how to take advantage of the vehicle's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. Among the units equipped with the new tank destroyer was the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. Like many specialized units in the American Army, the men of this battalion had a specific mission. They were not simply another armored unit. Their role was to hunt enemy tanks, protect infantry formations, and respond rapidly whenever German armor threatened to break through Allied lines. Training emphasized patience and discipline. Crews were taught to study the terrain carefully, identify likely routes for enemy tanks, and position themselves where they could fire effectively without being easily detected. The first shot was often the most important. A well-placed opening round could destroy a target before the enemy even realized where the attack had come from. Accuracy mattered as much as courage. The large 90mm shells were powerful, but ammunition was limited. Every shot had to count. Crews practiced estimating distances, adjusting their aim, and coordinating with spotters who could help identify targets from concealed positions. Despite the impressive power of their weapon, the men who operated the M36 knew that they were still vulnerable. Their armor was thinner than most tanks. Their turret was open to the sky. A single artillery fragment or well-placed enemy shell could end the fight instantly. Survival depended on staying hidden, choosing the right moment to strike, and trusting the skill of the crew. As winter approached in late 1944, many of these tank destroyer crews had no idea how important their new vehicles were about to become. They trained, maintained their equipment, and waited for orders. Then, in December, the German army launched its massive offensive through the Ardennes. Suddenly, the quiet forests of Belgium and Luxembourg were filled with advancing infantry, artillery barrages, and columns of German armor pushing through the snow. Among those armored columns were the most feared machines Germany had ever sent into battle: King Tigers. The enormous vehicles rolled forward with thick armor and deadly 88mm guns, confident that few Allied weapons could challenge them directly. But hidden among the American forces preparing to defend the region were several units equipped with a weapon the German crews did not yet fully understand, a weapon designed specifically to destroy tanks like theirs, the M36 Jackson. And in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the moment was coming when its crews would finally test whether speed, skill, and a powerful gun could defeat one of the most heavily armored tanks of the entire war.
By December 1944, the Ardennes forest had become one of the coldest battlefields in Europe. Snow covered the narrow roads, thick pine trees blocked visibility, and temperatures dropped far below freezing. For soldiers on both sides, the environment itself was almost as dangerous as the enemy. When the German offensive began, many American units were completely unprepared for the scale of the attack. The The sudden advance of infantry and armored divisions created chaos across large sections of the front. Communication lines were cut, supply routes were disrupted, and small groups of soldiers often found themselves fighting isolated battles in the forests and villages scattered throughout the region. For the crews of the M36 Jackson tank destroyers, the winter conditions made an already dangerous job even harder. Unlike most tanks, the turret of the M36 was open at the top. This design allowed better visibility and faster loading of the powerful 90mm gun, but in the Ardennes winter, it became a constant source of suffering for the crew. Freezing wind blew directly into the fighting compartment. Snow fell into the turret and melted against the metal surfaces, turning into ice. The crew members had to operate heavy equipment, load massive shells, and aim their weapon while their hands slowly lost feeling from the cold. Thick gloves made it difficult to handle ammunition properly, but removing them meant risking frostbite within minutes. Some soldiers later described the experience as fighting inside an open metal box placed directly in the middle of a blizzard. Temperatures in parts of the Ardennes during the battle dropped to nearly -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuel froze, weapons malfunctioned, and even simple tasks like starting an engine could become a struggle. Mechanics worked constantly just to keep vehicles operational. Inside the turret of the M36, the gun crew had to maintain focus despite the freezing conditions. A typical crew included a commander, a gunner, a loader, and a driver, along with other supporting personnel. Each member had a specific role, and the success of the entire vehicle depended on everyone working together smoothly. The commander scanned the battlefield for targets. The gunner aimed the powerful 90mm cannon. The loader handled the heavy shells and fed them into the breech as quickly as possible. Each round weighed more than 40 pounds. In normal conditions, loading the weapon required strength and coordination. In freezing weather, when hands were numb and muscles stiff, it became even harder. Yet speed was critical. In a tank battle, the difference between survival and destruction could be measured in seconds. Despite these hardships, the crews continued their mission. The forests of the Ardennes offered both danger and opportunity. Thick trees and winding roads limited visibility for everyone. German tank crews could not always see what lay ahead of them, and that created a chance for well-positioned defenders to strike unexpectedly. Tank destroyer doctrine depended on exactly this kind of situation. Instead of charging directly into battle like traditional armored units, tank destroyer crews were trained to hide, observe, and wait. They studied the terrain carefully, searching for positions where their guns could cover likely routes of enemy movement. Road intersections, narrow valleys, and forest clearings were especially important. If a German armored column advanced along one of these routes, a concealed M36 could open fire from a distance before the enemy realized where the shot had come from. With the powerful 90mm cannon, even heavily armored tanks could become vulnerable if hit from the right angle. The key was patience. Sometimes crews waited for hours in complete silence, watching the snow-covered landscape through binoculars and gun sights. Every distant engine noise could signal approaching enemy vehicles. Every movement in the trees might reveal advancing infantry or reconnaissance units. During these long waits, the cold seemed even more intense. The metal surfaces of the turret felt like ice against exposed skin. Breath turned instantly into clouds of frost. Some soldiers wrapped scarves and blankets around themselves whenever possible, but the open turret allowed the freezing air to circulate constantly. Yet despite the discomfort, many crews understood that their exposed position also gave them an advantage. With no roof above them, the commander could stand higher and observe the battlefield more clearly than crews inside fully enclosed tanks. Spotting an enemy vehicle even a few seconds earlier could make a crucial difference during an ambush. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, those few seconds could decide everything. German armored columns often moved cautiously through the region, aware that American forces might be hidden somewhere ahead.
But even experienced crews could not watch every direction at once. The terrain forced them to follow roads and narrow clearings where maneuvering such heavy vehicles was possible. A 70-ton King Tiger could not easily drive through thick forest. This meant that many engagements occurred along predictable paths. American tank destroyer crews learned to take advantage of this limitation, positioning themselves where the enemy would have little room to escape once the firing began. Still, the danger was always present. If a German tank spotted an M36 first, the situation could turn deadly almost instantly. The armor of the American vehicle was not designed to withstand the powerful 88mm gun of a heavy German tank. One accurate shot could destroy the vehicle and its crew in a single moment. Because of this, concealment was everything. Crews used natural cover whenever possible. Vehicles were hidden behind tree lines, inside ruined farmyards, or along the edges of hills where only the gun barrel needed to be exposed. Camouflage nets and branches were sometimes placed over the turret to break up the vehicle's shape. From a distance, the tank destroyer could almost blend perfectly into the winter landscape. This style of fighting earned some crews a quiet reputation among the infantry units they supported. Soldiers began to refer to them as hunters waiting in the forest, machines that appeared suddenly, fired a devastating shot, and then vanished before the enemy could respond. Among some infantrymen, a nickname began to circulate. They called them ghost tanks, not because the vehicles were invisible, but because their presence was only revealed at the exact moment their guns fired. By the time the enemy realized where the attack had come from, the tank destroyer might already be repositioning for another shot. In the brutal winter of the Ardennes, this method of fighting slowly began to change the balance between the massive German heavy tanks and the lighter American vehicles waiting in the forest. German crews believed their armor protected them from most threats at long range. Many expected that if a battle occurred, it would happen at closer distances, where their powerful guns could dominate. What they did not always expect was an enemy capable of striking accurately from far beyond those distances. Somewhere in the snow-covered hills and forests, several M36 crews were already preparing to attempt something that most tank gunners considered nearly impossible: long-distance shots against one of the most heavily armored tanks ever built. If successful, those shots would prove that even the most feared armored giant on the battlefield could still fall to skill, patience, and a weapon used in exactly the right way.
By the third week of December 1944, the fighting in the Ardennes had turned into a brutal contest of endurance. German armored columns were still pushing through the region, but the initial shock of the offensive had begun to fade. American units were regrouping, reorganizing defensive lines, and slowly learning how to counter the enemy's advance. For the crews of the M36 Jackson tank destroyers, the battlefield was becoming a place where patience mattered more than speed. Their vehicles were not designed to charge forward into direct duels with heavy tanks. Instead, they were hunters waiting for the right opportunity. And sometimes, that opportunity came from very far away. One of the men who would become part of this story was Sergeant William McLan, a member of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. Like many soldiers in his unit, he had spent weeks operating in freezing conditions, moving through the forests and villages of the Ardennes while searching for signs of German armor. His crew knew exactly what kind of enemy they might face. German heavy tanks, especially the massive King Tigers, had already built a terrifying reputation among Allied soldiers. Their armor was thick enough to resist most weapons at long range, and their powerful 88mm guns could destroy American vehicles with frightening efficiency. But the men inside the M36 Jackson tank destroyers understood something important. Their own weapon, the 90mm gun, had a reach that surprised many people. When properly aimed, it could strike targets far beyond the distances where most tank battles normally occurred.
The key was accurate range estimation, careful adjustment of the gun sight, and the patience to wait for the perfect moment. Late in December, during one tense period of the fighting, McLand's crew found themselves observing an area of open terrain bordered by forest and low hills. Snow covered the ground, and visibility was limited by the winter haze that often hung over the landscape. From their concealed position, they watched the distant horizon through binoculars. At first, there was nothing but silence and drifting snow. Then movement appeared. Through the haze, dark shapes slowly emerged in the distance. Engines rumbled faintly across the frozen fields. Large armored vehicles were moving forward, their outlines becoming clearer as they approached the open ground. Even before the details were fully visible, the experienced soldiers watching through their optics could recognize the shape: the heavy turret, the long gun barrel, the massive silhouette. King Tigers. For a moment, the situation looked almost hopeless. The German tanks were far away, but they were also among the most heavily armored machines in the entire war. Many gunners would not even attempt to fire at such targets from extreme range. The chance of hitting anything important seemed too small. But McLand and his crew understood the capabilities of their weapon. The 90mm gun had excellent ballistic performance. Its shells could travel at extremely high speed, maintaining energy over long distances. With the correct elevation and precise aim, the gun could reach targets much farther away than most tank crews expected. Still, this kind of shot required more than just pulling the trigger. The gunner had to estimate the range correctly. Wind conditions could slightly affect the shell's path. Even the temperature of the air could influence how the projectile traveled through the atmosphere. Every factor mattered. Inside the open turret, the crew worked together quietly. The commander observed the distant targets and helped estimate the distance. The gunner adjusted the sight carefully, raising the barrel slightly higher to account for the long trajectory. The loader prepared the heavy shell, lifting it into position despite the freezing cold numbing his hands. The German tanks continued moving across the distant ground, apparently unaware that they were being watched. To them, the American lines were still far away. They likely believed they were well outside the effective range of enemy guns. That assumption would soon prove dangerously wrong. When the first shot was ready, the crew paused for a moment. At such extreme range, even a small aiming error could cause the shell to miss by dozens of meters. The gunner steadied his aim, aligning the sight with the distant silhouette of one of the heavy tanks. The commander gave the order to fire. The massive gun thundered, the recoil shaking the entire vehicle as the shell launched toward the distant target. For several seconds, nothing happened. At such long range, the shell took time to reach its destination. Everyone inside the turret watched through optics and binoculars, waiting to see where the shot would land. Then, far across the snowy ground, a sudden flash appeared near the German tank. The shell had struck. Even at that distance, the impact was unmistakable. The enormous vehicle halted abruptly, smoke beginning to rise from its hull. Inside the American tank destroyer, the crew realized that something extraordinary had just happened. They had hit a King Tiger from a distance most tank crews would consider impossible. But the moment of success did not end the danger. The remaining German tanks immediately began reacting to the unexpected attack. Crews searched the distant terrain for the source of the shot. Engines roared as vehicles attempted to reposition or identify the hidden enemy. McLand's crew quickly prepared another round. At such moments, speed was essential. If the German tanks located their position, the response from the powerful 88mm guns could arrive quickly and with devastating accuracy. The loader lifted another heavy shell into the breach. The gunner adjusted the aim again, compensating for the previous shot and the movement of the enemy vehicles. Once more, the command to fire echoed inside the turret. Another thunderous blast sent a shell racing across the frozen battlefield. This engagement would soon become one of the most remarkable long-distance tank fights of the war. Reports from the battle later suggested that one of the destroyed King Tigers had been hit from a distance approaching 3,000 yards, nearly 2 miles. For many soldiers and historians, this seemed almost unbelievable. Tank battles were usually fought at distances far shorter than that. At such extreme range, hitting a moving armored vehicle required both remarkable skill and a powerful weapon capable of delivering lethal force even after traveling that far. Yet in the cold forests of the Ardennes, it had happened. The massive German tank, designed to dominate the battlefield with armor and firepower, had been destroyed by a vehicle that many soldiers once dismissed as lightly protected and dangerously exposed. In that moment, something important changed. The myth that the King Tiger was untouchable at long range had been shattered. German crews could no longer assume that distance alone would keep them safe. Somewhere out there were American tank destroyers capable of striking from far beyond the expected limits of armored combat. For the men of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, it was proof that their unusual vehicle and demanding training had a purpose. Even against the most feared tank of the war, skill, patience, and the right weapon could still change the outcome of the battle.
By the end of December 1944, the Ardennes offensive had lost momentum, but the impact of the American defense was becoming clear. The M36 Jackson tank destroyers, once dismissed by some as fragile and vulnerable, had proven themselves capable of feats that many thought impossible. Yet despite these successes, the story of the M36 Jackson and the soldiers who operated it would remain largely unknown to the broader public for decades. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion and other similar units continued to engage German armored formations throughout Europe. They faced some of the most feared tanks of the war, Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers, and yet they achieved victories through strategy, precision, and a remarkable understanding of terrain. These crews often fought in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Freezing winds whipped through the open turrets, snow and ice covered the gun sights, and each engagement could be the difference between survival and total destruction. The paradox of the M36 Jackson was that it lacked the heavy armor that most tanks relied on, yet this very weakness forced crews to become disciplined, patient, and innovative. They could not rely on brute force. Every shot had to count. This created a type of soldier who became highly skilled in observation, range estimation, and teamwork. Even with the deadly 90mm gun, the success of the M36 depended entirely on human skill and tactical judgment. The psychological impact of the M36 was also significant. German crews had grown accustomed to dominating the battlefield with their heavy tanks, particularly the King Tiger, which had earned a reputation for being nearly invincible. When an M36 crew destroyed a King Tiger at distances approaching 3,000 yards, it shattered not just the physical tank, but the psychological advantage that the German armor had once held. Suddenly, distance was no longer a guarantee of safety. The fear and uncertainty that this created in German crews caused changes in tactics, slowed their advance, and ultimately contributed to the Allied defense of the Ardennes. Yet despite their effectiveness, the M36 Jackson never achieved the fame or iconic status of the M4 Sherman. Shermans were everywhere, ubiquitous symbols of American industrial power and resilience, but the M36, a specialized tank destroyer, remained relatively rare. Its unusual open-top design, while tactically advantageous in some situations, made it seem exposed and delicate, particularly compared to the thickly armored German tanks it faced. Post-war histories often highlighted mass-produced tanks and famous battles, leaving specialized tank destroyer actions like those of the 703rd largely in the shadows. The legacy of these crews, however, is profound. The M36 demonstrated that a carefully trained, disciplined, and patient unit could overcome even the most technologically superior opponents. In one iconic engagement, Sergeant William McClellan and his crew destroyed a King Tiger at nearly 3,000 yards, the longest confirmed tank kill of the Second World War. The shot required precise calculation, steady nerves, and flawless execution by every member of the crew. The achievement became a benchmark of long-range armored combat, showing that knowledge and preparation could triumph over raw firepower. Operating an M36 in the winter of 1944 was more than just a test of skill. It was a test of human endurance. Crews faced relentless cold, often spending hours in freezing temperatures, hands numb and muscles stiff, waiting for the enemy to appear. The open-top turret exposed them to everything: snow, wind, artillery fragments, and small arms fire. Despite these hardships, they continued to perform at an extraordinary level, demonstrating a combination of courage, discipline, and ingenuity that would become legendary within their units. The success of the M36 also influenced post-war armored doctrine. Military planners observed that specialized vehicles with superior firepower could compensate for lighter armor if employed correctly. Tank destroyer concepts evolved into more integrated anti-tank strategies in modern armies, and the lessons learned in the Ardennes informed the design of post-war self-propelled guns and main battle tanks. The emphasis on long-range engagement, concealment, and tactical patience can be traced directly back to experiences with vehicles like the M36. For the soldiers themselves, the memory of the Ardennes winter never faded. They had faced some of the most formidable tanks ever built, often under the harshest conditions imaginable. Exposure to freezing wind and snow, combined with the constant threat of enemy fire, created an environment in which only skill, coordination, and determination could ensure survival. Their triumphs were the product not just of superior weapons, but a human ability to adapt and innovate under extreme pressure. And yet, despite these remarkable accomplishments, the story of the M36 Jackson and the men who operated it has remained relatively obscure. The daring long-range shots, the ambushes in the snow-covered forests, and the destruction of nearly invincible King Tigers were overshadowed by larger narratives of the war. These ghosts of the Ardennes, as some infantrymen came to call them, moved unseen, struck suddenly, and disappeared before the enemy could respond. Their victories were quiet, precise, and deadly, a stark contrast to the chaos of tank battles often depicted in history books and films. Even today, the lessons from the M36 remain relevant. Technology alone does not determine the outcome of a battle. Human skill, training, and courage are often the decisive factors. The men who fought in these open-topped tank destroyers demonstrated that even the most feared weapon could be defeated through ingenuity, patience, and discipline. They showed that no machine, no matter how heavily armored or intimidating, is truly invincible when faced with a well-trained and determined opponent. In the final analysis, the M36 Jackson and its crews proved that the most important weapons on the battlefield are often not those with the thickest armor or the largest guns. Instead, they are the men and women who understand their tools, master the terrain, and remain calm under fire. The Ardennes winter of 1944 was a crucible in which such soldiers were tested and emerged victorious, proving that skill, strategy, and courage can turn the tide of battle even against seemingly unstoppable odds. The ghostly presence of these tank destroyer crews, hidden in forests, enduring freezing temperatures, firing with precision at targets once thought untouchable, remains a testament to human ingenuity and bravery. Their story reminds us that in war, as in life, careful preparation, patience, and courage often make the difference between survival and defeat, between myth and reality, between the unstoppable and the vanquished.